And now we're going on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dave Saunders. He is the co-founder and vice president of product development for Silicon Valley-based medical systems creator Galen Robotics. Dave is a serial tech sector entrepreneur, and he has over 40 internet-based products from inception to market that he's created since 1991. Dave has led diverse product development programs, including desktop internet software, access concentration, telco switching, virtual machine clustering, and computer vision guided surgical tools. Dave is an ardent supporter of the Internet of Things, which he has said that he envisions as an opportunity to have a connected world that enriches the lives of others. So Dave, I'm very intrigued to hear what your information is. Please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Let's see. Can I advance the slides? How's this go? Oh, here we go. Look at that. Yes, well, thank you so much for having me on this. It's been actually great just listening to everybody else so far. You know, when I was working on my slides, I knew I was probably going to have to fold my content into the things that were being said by the other folks. And you know, it's interesting to listen to the perspectives of the previous two speakers, because one of the words I use a lot when it comes to my involvement with medical devices is that we are building products that end up in an ecosystem. You know, I've got nearly 30 years of professional experience on the internet, and when I first began, there were still areas of the internet that required a security clearance because they were still considered to be part of the DARPA net. And so just the overall paradigm of how security was viewed when it came to internet connectivity was completely different than it is today. And my experience when talking to other medical devices, I have technology partnerships with several Fortune 100 medical device companies, and I still tend to see an very odd attitude that was, you actually even discussed this and mentioned this earlier, Rebecca, that, you know, there's this assumption that security is somehow just magically manifested at hospitals because, oh gosh, the only people that are going to be using medical devices are cleared for use because they're the ones wearing scrubs. And somehow that's supposed to be part of the security assurance in these hospitals. And that attitude I see bleeding into the medical device industry, where the assumption is, well, I sell this big expensive device, therefore I don't have to worry about it. Or even worse, my device doesn't connect to the internal network, or it doesn't connect to the internet, and therefore it's secure. So, you know, when we look at cybersecurity, there are lots of great punch lists that we've already seen in the previous two presentations, but I would also really, really advise people that when we look at InfoSec and when we look at cybersecurity, it's a cultural change that we really have to look at that goes throughout all aspects of the organization. Let me pop forward here. When we look at the news and we look at the types of things that have happened, some of these slides have already popped up, but we've seen, obviously, a large-scale ransomware attack. We don't know how that ransomware attack got its foothold into Merck yet, but if we go outside of this industry, and there was another rather infamous cybersecurity break-in to a very large media company that is also known for lots of technologies, and about 4 terabytes of data was lifted from internal public servers. And I reviewed some of what was taken away, and there was literally a folder labeled private credit card information. Well, there's the target painted. And in that folder, there was a non-password protected Excel worksheet that had over 10,000 credit card numbers, names, web address, web account infos for all of the corporate Amex cards. So here's, a file that's available, if you were working for that company. It appeared, based on what people were able to infer when this was being analyzed, that pretty much anybody that had access to that internal network had access, if they knew where to look, for a file that actually contained over 10,000 web passwords and account numbers for Amex cards for internal use. So, there's a cultural thing where we have to understand that everyone needs cybersecurity training. Everyone needs to understand their role in providing good information security policies. And when we look at our responsibilities as medical device vendors, and this is where I'm coming in from, obviously, is that we're joining an ecosystem. So my device is coming onto an existing network. I have to make certain assumptions about that network. And while I'm certain that there are lots of CIOs and IT directors that are, very, very talented, I'll tell you, one of my assumptions for my medical device is that the network is not secure. I never make the assumption that my device is being installed in a secure network, because my nearly 30 years worth of internet experience has told me that there's no such thing as a secure network. And so those kinds of paradigm assumptions need to inform your design, and you need to have those kinds of cultural understandings in place in order to bake good security into your company as well as the device that you're building. And these things can be really, you have to have some imagination to really think about these things as well. One of the examples that I just pulled up from the news is outside of the medical industry, but if we look at the story of what happened with Stuxnet and the malware attack on the uranium centrifuges in Iran, this is fascinating because this malware specifically had information built into it that knew exactly what model of centrifuges were being used in Iran. It knew what log output was supposed to look like. So the Windows machine that this malware ended up on was able to send commands to those centrifuges and run them at about 200% maximum speed. And the entire time, it was also overriding log output for those centrifuges' operations so that it looked like that they were operating normally. And that's a really scary concept, because that means that we even need to make some risk assessments as to how reliable our own internally generated data is when it comes to our medical devices. And one of the recalls that has now happened over cybersecurity, the details are, some of them you have to infer, but it appears that the possible cybersecurity vulnerability for an infusion system actually included the ability to inject fake log output or fake usage data into that injection system, which means that not only could it have potentially delivered lethal doses of drugs to patients automatically, but it would have appeared from any other type of examination apart from the autopsy that the device was operating correctly. And so we need to even look at our own data when it comes to cybersecurity vulnerabilities and make sure that we know or that we have ways of knowing if the data that we're looking at is really the data that it should be. And attacks on networks are also a really important issue. Children's Hospital was attacked. This actually was a malicious attack by a subgroup identifying themselves as anonymous. They took down the hospital's access to the internet for several days. If you have a medical device that needs to dial home for information, or as we move years from now, if we start building medical devices that are going to use cloud-based CPU farms to supplement machine learning capabilities or download on the fly certain kinds of information sets that allow the medical device to provide more complex behaviors that are all software-based, what happens if your access to the internet is cut off? Does the capabilities of your medical device do they have a backup, or are they able to operate at all? So, you know, you need to really consider what happens when the rest of the network is on fire around you. How does your device operate? Oops. There we go. Now, as a company founder and board member and C-level executive, I have to look at some of this stuff from the standpoint of what is my company really required to do. And obviously, all those things affect, you know, my expenditures. You know, who do I have to hire? What are ultimately the responsibilities of my company? And when it comes to the cybersecurity requirements for the FDA, I have seen multiple articles published recently where arguments have been made that right now the cybersecurity requirements from the FDA are nothing more than guidelines, and they don't really have any teeth. But I look at that very differently because I have now seen 2 executive orders and a lot of obviously consternation going behind that, saying that it has been identified that cybersecurity risks throughout all industries are a major issue to U.S. and the U.S. security. And that executive order that started a lot of this, you know, drives all of the agencies in the U.S. government to shore up their respective industries and make sure that they fall into a compliance. So just because the FDA may not have full statutory authority at the moment to demand that I include cybersecurity practices in my product design, I'm going to take all of what's going on right now in the past couple of years of history as a fair warning shot that I certainly do not want to be caught in a situation where my only argument to the public, to my board, to my customers, to the patients, and to the FDA are that, well, yeah, but it was just a guideline. So as far as I'm concerned, and this is in fact literally what I have told the board recently, is that we have been given more than ample warning to take care of this ourselves, and therefore we will. So cybersecurity is a part of our development process, which means that every single aspect of our product, both from a hardware standpoint and from a software standpoint, has a security review associated with it. So we are developing those practices as part of our normal development process. Now, those development processes will continue on into post-market, where we then expand those things into regularly doing our own sorts of penetration testing, working with white hats out there. This week, in fact, is DEF CON, which is a rather notable gathering of hackers and explorers into the cybersecurity world. We want those kinds of people to help us learn about hidden security risks, and we want to take what we can learn from them and apply it to our device and make ourselves as secure as possible. So when it comes to, you know, the perspective of should a company actually take cybersecurity seriously, and do we need to wait for more authority, if you will, from the FDA to demand it of us, I say that ship has sailed, and there really is no discussion on this point. Let's get it done, and that I'm certainly doing my part for that. So when we bake security into our products, as I mentioned earlier, the first thing you need to do is you need to make sure that the entire company, everyone realizes that cybersecurity is something that affects everyone, be it, who are you letting through the doors, who has access to your machine room, who has access to internal servers, what do they have access to when they log on to a shared folder. You need to start things there because that's where invasion points can begin. And without going too deeply far afield, it is not necessary for someone to attack you through the internet to get onto your network. And it is in fact not even necessary for a hacker to have access to your internal network to get access to your data that's on your network. Social engineering is a real issue, and it is something that some rather infamous hackers have taken advantage of to get access to amazing types of data without even once touching a keyboard on their own. And so it's really important that good security training permeate your entire organization because if you don't have that well situated, the other stuff are really, it's just window dressing as far as I'm concerned. And, my internal mantra is that a robot is not a product all by itself. And so even though I have a surgical robot under development, and I think it does some fantastic things for practitioners as well as patients, and I think it will offer some great benefits when we are finally on the other side of FDA clearance, the robot itself is not our product. An entire company is the meta product. And so there are aspects of how the product works and how it interacts with the network, how it interacts with the users, and then even in terms of business intelligence capabilities that I have to know when the robot needs maintenance, when certain parts need to be replaced. All of those aspects work together to really give me the product offering that gives me the sum total of benefit to my market. And so I need to look at all of those things that my robot can potentially touch. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the circle I draw around what I consider to be my product. And to be quite candid, I think that in my experience, a large portion of the medical device industry doesn't really embrace that concept. They look at their gizmo, even if it's a big navigation system, as the thing unto itself, and they draw the lines on security for those. And I've even heard arguments of, well, the FDA doesn't require us to do risk mitigation beyond our own borders. Well, okay, maybe that's true. I don't know. I'm going to listen later to the panel discussion to hear some opinions on that. But even if that is the case from a statutory standpoint, I don't think it's the case from an ethical standpoint. I'm going to bake that stuff in. So, again, part of my mantra is that there is no security but the security I make. And so I'm responsible for how my device operates on a network and how it operates at a customer premise. And so when I look at the guidelines and when I look at the available tools out there to help me build security into my products, protecting, building it initially, having good encryption between points, having my extraneous ports closed, I got to start by protecting my system the best I can. Once it's out there, I need to have ways to detect problems and figure out where improvements need to be made. And depending on what those improvements are, depending on how severe they might have been, I need to make sure that I'm informing the public as to what those potential risks had been. I need to be as transparent as possible because that's best for everyone. And I also have a really interesting melange of securities and vulnerabilities that have their own context. I have cybersecurity, and that has an interesting set of problems and challenges. But there's also this issue of Part 11, compliance in the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's about documents and records. Are they verifiable? Are they the correct version? How do I know that? Well, you know what? Inside of my device, I have records. I have what you might argue as being documents about the device as it's operating, as controls going back and forth between the master and slave in a medical device that has software architecture. Well, I think I have some Part 11 responsibilities that go into the device itself, and so those are really important to understand. All the while, I also have to make sure that patient information is protected. I have aspirations that eventually my surgical robot, like many in the marketplace, will eventually have some machine learning capabilities. That means I do need to collect some kinds of information about the procedures as they're happening so I can use those as part of the architecture later on. Well, that means that I also need to make sure that if I'm doing that, patient information cannot be exposed if I have a malicious situation happen. So basic robot architecture is really just and this applies to most medical devices that have some sort of software. There's a master, and that's where the CPU are. That's where the CPU is in the brains. And then there's a whole bunch of sensors. There's pumps or whatever that actually do things for the patient. And that's your basic architecture. Well, how is the data transferred between the CPU and those sensors or those action devices in your medical device? So this applies to more than just robots. You need to really recognize the potential for man-in-the-middle attacks. Can somebody physically alter your device in such a way, maybe with some little gizmo, if they get access to the hospital, clamp on something? This isn't science fiction. These things are actually possible. Could I have my device interfered with if somebody just plugged a little dongle in between the Ethernet cable or into an open USB port? And so when I look at the big picture, my device, as I've said, is not an island. It integrates into the rest of the network. And so I'm potentially going to be sending updates automatically to the electronic health record system because I know that that's what the market is starting to demand more and more. They don't want medical transcriptionists manually walking data back and forth. I should be able to update a patient record directly. Well, that creates all kinds of issues that I need to make sure I address. I have data that I want to collect at the mothership. There's a potential for tablets or iPhone access or smartphone access that give me perhaps ability to do some sort of pre-surgical planning that could be a really beneficial thing, not only to the patient because of ultimate workload and them getting their care as quickly as possible, but it's also a great thing for the doctors to perhaps be able to confer with another practitioner and do that from a very convenient tablet interface. And then also remember that there are maintenance ports on a lot of medical devices. I heard a story about an EEG that had an open USB port that was there only for receiving patch upgrades, and yet a patient saw it, and how do we respond to USB ports? Well, personally, I never plug into a USB port that I don't know where it came from, but a lot of people see those as free electricity, and so a patient just plugged their phone into the USB port of an EEG, and it put it into a complete freeze mode, which I guess is a pretty good mitigation strategy if you have some foreign object plugged into an open port, but that also was, if you think about it, that's also a very simple way to render a medical device interoperative. If that's your failure mode, all I have to do is plug some kind of dongle into my medical device, and I can take it out. So we really need to look at risk management in a very creative way and really understand what not just malicious attacks could be, but what could be innocent misuses of our device that we need to make sure we handle gracefully. So, in summary, assume the network that you're on is not secure. That needs to be your default assumption. Don't assume that your only risks are network-based. People can have physical access to your device, and they might be able to do things inadvertently or maliciously that you don't want them to do. remain vigilant and make cybersecurity part of your culture. And don't assume that people with physical access are always going to do the right thing. People make mistakes, or people just inadvertently do things that seemed right at the time, like plugging their phone into an open USB port because they were on red and they were waiting for an important call. It could have been a doctor. It could have been a nurse. They're not doing something malicious. You just need to figure out how to handle those weird events gracefully. And then most importantly, even though a lot of this stuff sounds, really scary and it seems like a lot of work, the only solution for true security for your medical device is to seal it in lead and dump it into the bottom of the ocean. And that's not good for anyone. Your device brings greater benefit to patient care and the industry when it's a connected part of this growing IoT ecosystem. And that's how you should be looking at it, that the risks are important, and you should certainly seek ways of actively mitigating all of your potential risks, but the benefits of a well-connected device simply outweigh the hassle that you, honestly do incur as a medical device vendor in developing a device that provides more access and more integrative capabilities with the rest of the world. So, even though these things do seem to be a hassle, I think it is important that everybody realize that the benefits of participating in Internet of Things in the medical industry is a great thing for everybody.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave. Very good points. And boy, I can give you some horror stories about open USB ports. And even just 5 years ago, I still found open dial-up modems doing war dialing. So, we have a long way to go still. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. And we might have some questions for you at the end here.
Great. Thank you.